Today we're going to talk about the mikvah and the role of the mikvah in a Jewish relationship. So a friend of ours, called my husband just 2 nights ago, and he had just finished watching the series on Netflix, Unorthodox, and he said to my husband, you know, I saw this film, this show, and I'm so upset, I'm so disturbed. Does your wife really use that mikvah thing that they portrayed in the show? And my husband started laughing and was sharing it with me afterwards. They apparently portrayed the mikvah in a pretty intimidating way. I don't know, maybe not, because I didn't see the film. I didn't see the show, but this friend of ours, Scott, was really turned off by the way that they portrayed the mikvah. And we were laughing because in our lives, in our relationship, the mikvah is such a treasured and beautiful experience. And it was almost humorous to have somebody come and look at something that we treasure as being something so horrific and something that would be so bad in a relationship. So today we're going to discuss it and hopefully dispel some of the misconceptions that are out there, and feel free to put some posts or questions in the comments if there are questions that you have from watching the show or otherwise that haven't been addressed. So let me start off by asking you, if I told you that I can provide healing for a trauma that you have been through, that I have a way to provide healing for you, how would you respond? I think all of us would jump at the opportunity. Well, at least the woman. Maybe the men would say, I don't know what trauma you're talking about. I haven't experienced trauma. I have no need to heal. Although I'm sure there are many men that are very emotionally in touch and self-aware and would like to heal and to grow and acknowledge that there have been traumas in their life. And then, you know, us women, I have to be fair, if I'm making fun of the men, I have to make fun of the women too. Us women, we spend a lot of time talking about our trauma, and we kind of come to the top of that curve where we're really immersed in the trauma and reliving it. And then sometimes instead of going down the other end of healing and moving on and growth, we kind of just slip right back to the beginning of where we were, right to the beginning of that bell curve, and say, yeah, let me talk about it again, because I can't find a way to actually grow and heal from it. But we all have things that impede us from living our best life and being our best selves. Some of it is things that we didn't appreciate from our childhood. You know, they say the only people that I know that have had functional childhoods are the people that I don't know well. Well, I'm sure that there are people that have had wonderful childhoods, but a lot of people can say that there are things in their childhood that are stopping them right now from being their best selves, or habits that they've picked up. And then, of course, as we developed as human beings, there are experiences that we've had that were not the best, unfortunately, and we want to get rid of those so that we can be our happiest, most self-confident, most productive self. And a lot of times, and a lot of us, go through tremendous efforts to try and look for that healing. It could be through talk therapy, through other types of energy healing that can release traumas in different parts of our body. It could be through aromatherapy. It could be through acupuncture, going to different places that create a certain liberation and a certain freedom from things that are holding us back. So I think if I would tell you that I have a way to let go and shed some of the things that have not been good influences on your life, I think you would jump at that opportunity. What does the Torah have to say about this? Well, the Torah talks a lot about healing from trauma and healing from spiritual impurity, from things that are locking our spirit from being unleashed and our most powerful spirited selves. And the Torah goes through a lot of situations where a person may be spiritually repressed, or to use the biblical lingo, impure, and the process that we go through to recover, to heal, to attain purity again. One of them is coming in contact with a dead body. Coming in contact with a dead body is actually a big mitzvah, because that meant that a lot of times that means that you are helping prepare the dead body for burial. But that then kind of contaminates the person to some extent, and then they need to go through a ritual purification. Another example is leprosy, tsaras, where a person had contacted this disease, this leprosy, and they need to go through a process of recovery. And in all of these processes, the culmination is immersion in the mikvah. A mikvah is a body of water. It could be a natural body of water, or it could be a man-made body of water. When I say man-made, I mean that the container of the water is man-made, but the water that comes in is natural or connected to a natural source. And this is called a mikvah. And this process of immersion in the mikvah sheds the person of the negativity that they may have come in touch with. And now they are completely free of it. Now you may ask, that's so silly. I mean, do you really think that just dipping in a body of water, okay, it has to be a natural source of water, okay, dipping in a natural source of water, people do that all the time. They go to the beach, they swim in a lake. That has an effect on my spirit, on my emotions? How is that possible? Well, the truth is that the way that God created the world is really telling us that truth just in our very biology. Water is the source of life. A child, a baby in utero, is swimming, so to speak, in the embryonic fluid for 9 months. That is the necessary ingredient to incubate growth. That creates health. That creates a rebirth, or in this case, a birth for the first time, but a rebirth from an embryo that's not able to be self-sustained to an independent baby that will grow up to be a full-fledged human being. Even plant life, obviously, needs water, needs to be soaked in water, needs to be watered in order to grow. The Torah tells us that the entire world was covered in water at the beginning of the process of creation. It says that God's Spirit hovered over the water. So the Torah is immediately giving us a picture of this earth, planet Earth, before it looked the way it does now, before it was differentiated and organized, and it was just covered in water. And the first thing God had to do was to separate the water to create dry land in part of the world, and of course retaining the water. Even in our own physiological and health pursuits, having a cold, refreshing cup of water, it wakes you up, it gives you tremendous energy. I tell my children when they're tired, when they're tired at night, I tell them to go to bed. But during the day, they're too tired for their Zoom classes. It's not really that you're tired. Maybe you're a little bored, but take a cold glass of water, better than a cup of coffee, better than a distraction that may wake you up. The water is going to just stream through your body and energize you. So this is the beautiful quality of water that Hashem gave us, that we see has biological benefits. Benefits is not the right word, but biologically spurs growth. And the same is true spiritually. In the parts of the world that we can't see or detect with the naked eye, we can't see spiritual impurity. We can't see when our spirit is blocked. But that's why God tells us, here is what you do. The biological, physical world mirrors the spiritual world that is invisible, and immersion in a mikvah helps give that new surge of energy, that rebirth, the ingredients for change. And this is also why the Torah tells us that right before the giving of the Torah, the Jews had to go through a ritual immersion. They all had to immerse themselves in a mikvah because they were about to go through a total transformation. They were about to receive the Torah. God was going to speak to them for the first time. They would hear God's voice, and they were going to be charged with a mandate, a set of rules, a set of responsibility to bring this world, uplift this world, draw godliness into the world, and be a light unto the nations. And in order to have the power to become what God wanted them to become, to have the confidence to stand up to those tall orders, to have a completely new perspective on life, to be transformed from a slave to an influencer, they needed to go through this process of ritual immersion in a body of water. Today we mimic that as well, and by mimic I don't mean to downplay it. Today we replicate that experience by a convert who goes to the mikvah before the final culmination of their conversion. So they walk down the steps of that small pool that we call a mikvah, and they are still non-Jewish. Even though they've prepared and studied, and even though they've been keeping the mitzvahs for a certain amount of time already, when they come out, they are a Jew. There has been a metamorphosis that has taken place. And that happens through going to the mikvah. So we can get a little bit of an understanding of how much value is put on the mitzvah of going to the mikvah. Now, today, after the destruction of the temple, a person who comes in contact with a dead body does not go to the mikvah. In fact, nobody goes to the mikvah aside for a woman after her menstrual cycle. She is the only one that goes to the mikvah and says a blessing. Men often go to the mikvah customarily, and therefore they don't say a bracha, a blessing, because it is a custom. It is not a mitzvah. A woman and her menstrual cycle is the only type of ritual purity and impurity that is still intact. And a woman has an opportunity to utilize this incredible healing power of the mikvah every single month that she is married and she is menstruating. So, does the Torah talk about healing from trauma? Absolutely. And the mikvah is a huge key in that process, and we're going to talk more about it. Hi, Alina. Thanks for watching. So, I want to talk about the most important mitzvah in the Torah. What is the most important mitzvah? Well, there's a lot of debate about what's the most important mitzvah. But let me tell you a story about some people who were debating the most important mitzvah. There was a community, a new community that was being started by a group of Jews who were escaping. They were refugees, and they came to a new country, and they were setting up shop. There were 100 or 200 of them, and they had nothing. In the country that they left everything behind, and they also had very little financial resources. So they came, they were safe, they thanked God that they were able to come to a new country, a new city, and create a new safe haven and a Jewish community there. But what should they do? They barely had enough money to settle down and buy and create houses, buy houses, or rent houses for themselves, much less a synagogue, a prayer book, a Torah scroll. All of that would be extra. So they wrote to a tremendous scholar, one of the leaders of the generation during that time, and they said, we have a very limited amount of resources. What should we do first? How should we set up shop? How do we go forward? And this great rabbi wrote back to them and said, the first thing to do is to pool together your resources and build a mikvah for women. That comes before anything else. It trumps the synagogue, and it trumps the Torah scroll and the prayer books and the Talmuds and everything else you wish for and you dream for and eventually you'll get. But all of those you can do without if need be. The mikvah you can't do without. That is essential. That is imperative. And that's the first investment that you should make in your community. And this precedent has been almost a given in Jewish communities for thousands of years. So they just excavated in the tunnels right beneath the Kotel, the western wall. They excavated a new mikvah that is 2,000 years old. This was a mikvah that was used probably by the priests who would immerse in the mikvah before they started their process of serving God in the temple. But throughout Israel, during the tremendous excavation processes that uncover all of these secrets and a glimpse into the life of Jews thousands of years ago, they're always uncovering mikvahs because it was such a big part of Jewish life. On the top of the Masada mountain, there is a beautiful mikvah that looks almost like a mikvah today, of course empty. And it's designed beautiful with a mosaic floor. And that was a mikvah created for Jewish women to use. Again, for Jewish married women who have their menstrual cycle to use on a monthly basis or as often as they get their period. And what's interesting about this mikvah on the top of Masada is that the Jews who were living on the top of Masada, which is a big mountain, were there because they were the last stronghold of independence after the Roman conquest of Judea, of the temple, in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Romans squashed all independent, I shouldn't say rebellious because they were just trying to maintain their independence, but in the eyes of the Romans, they were rebelling against the Roman control. And they fought a war, and the Romans won. The Jews were heavily outnumbered, although they fought bravely. But one group of Jews ran away, and they were hiding, and they were going to stay or try to regain their independence. And they all moved to the top of this mountain, Masada, because they knew that it would be hard for the Romans to fight them on the top of that mountain. And they were there for a limited amount of time. Not only that, they knew that eventually the Romans would be able to climb up that mountain and pull together their resources. And although the Jews would throw down rocks and try and protect themselves with the little ammunition that they had, the Romans would eventually be able to conquer them. And therefore, they were living a very precarious life. They had a limited amount of time. They actually had suicidal remedies to take, which they in fact used once saw the Romans were advancing to the top of the mountain of Masada. They all killed themselves so that they wouldn't have to be killed and tortured by the Romans. So they had just a few months to live, a few weeks to live. And yet, during the time that they were alive, they knew if they were alive and they were living as Jews, they needed to have a mikvah for the woman. That is part and parcel of Jewish life. Not only part and parcel, it is an integral part of Jewish life. It's a must. It's a treasure. You know, more recently, under the communist rule in the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution in 1917 and later the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the goals of the Bolsheviks, of the communists, was to try and create a religion-free society that applied to both Christianity, which was very strong in the Roman Eastern Orthodox Church, and Jews. And they went to great lengths to try and snuff out religion. They called religion the opium of the masses. And they destroyed beautiful, very landmarks that were very religious and that people valued very much in society, but the communists said we need to get rid of it. And of course, in their educational system, they taught the youth that religion is a joke, and religion takes away from equality. And they tried very hard to make sure that Jews will give up their, in their mind, ridiculous beliefs in God and in religious practices. And one of the things that they put tremendous effort into accomplishing was shutting down the mikvahs. Again, knowing that without a mikvah, there's no Jewish life. It kind of, it's impeded so much. It's like living with your hands tied behind your back. It's like going for the guttural, going for the most vulnerable spot in a person's life, in a community's life. Not only did they shut it down, what they would do is send communist officials to come, KGB agents, and they would drain the mikveh. Okay. They could still possibly theoretically refill it with water after the communists left, but no. They filled that mikveh with cement. So now the mikveh is filled with cement, and the cement dries and it's not a mikveh anymore. There's no way to refill it with water. And that was absolutely devastating to the Jewish communities. And they went around from city to city, shtetl to shtetl, and that was the protocol. Drain the mikveh, fill it with cement. And it had a tremendous impact, negative impact on the Jewish communities. Now, there were people that were so dedicated to the mitzvah of going to the mikvah that they found ways to create secret mikvahs. So it wasn't the old style public mikvah that was connected to a shul. It was a secret mikvah that they built in someone's basement or in a trapdoor in their kitchen. And they knew that if the communists found out about that secret mikvah, they would be in trouble. They would be jailed, they would be fined, they could even be killed for a crime like that, subversion against the Soviet government. And yet, despite the danger, there were hundreds of people, hundreds of women in communist Russia that used these secret hidden mikvahs. In some cases, the woman had to travel by train to get to the secret mikvah that was in the next village because there wasn't one in their village. And sometimes they would go to the mikvah in a natural body of water if they were lucky enough to live near the ocean or a river or a river that was big enough or a lake that was big enough. But since it's cold for so much of the year in Russia, they had to wait until the water was liquid enough to be able to immerse. And at those times I was in between. I'm assuming in the dead of winter it was like it was just a rock solid. And in the summer it was probably more able to be used as a mikvah. But in the middle there would be a thick layer of ice. But underneath that ice, there was water, like all those stories of people going ice skating and going ice skating in a natural lake and falling in, God forbid. But so that's what they did. They intentionally would break the sheet of ice that was on the top of the lake, and then they would immerse in the mikvah. And you could imagine how cold the water must have been to go in and immerse in the mikvah like that. And yet there were women, and not one and not 10, but hundreds, who valued that mitzvah so dearly that they would go and break the first layer of ice and take a deep breath, muster up their bravery, and take off their clothing, and dip and immerse into this very, very cold lake that was frozen on top. There's actually a story about a family who was in Russia, religious family, Hasidic family, and they very much wanted to leave, but they were unable to. The communists made it virtually impossible to migrate and to immigrate. And this family was able to send a picture out to a relative of theirs who lived in New York. And their relative in New York, who lived in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, was so happy to have this family picture of their cousins in the Soviet Union. and so happy and proud to see that they were able to maintain their Jewish identity, their Jewish faith, and their Jewish observance, despite the harsh, almost impossible conditions that the communists placed on the Jewish communities. And he was so proud that the next time he went past the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he took the picture with him and he brought it to the Rebbe and he said, "Rebbe, I want to show you this picture of my relatives in the Soviet Union." And the Rebbe looked at the picture and he was staring at this one child, one of their children. The Rebbe was like mesmerized by that child. And later on, this relative in America spoke to their relative in the Soviet Union. This may have been when their relatives in the Soviet Union ended up getting permission to come to America. And they said, I brought this picture to the Rebbe, and this one child, the Rebbe was like so drawn to. The Rebbe was like amazed by this child. Is there something super special about this child? And the husband and wife kind of looked at each other with a sparkle in their eyes. And the wife shared that there was once a time that she wanted to go to the mikvah, was her scheduled time to go to the mikvah, and the only mikvah that was available was a body of water that was frozen over with ice. And she went to that body of water and she was just like debating, I don't know if I could do this. I'm going to be too cold. I'm afraid I'm going to be frostbitten. I don't know if I could do it. And she was like back and forth. And then she was thinking, but this is such a big mitzvah. This is just, I'm going to try. I'm going to really try and do it. And that's what she did. She took off her clothing. And of course, when she took off her clothing, I'm sure it was in a way that was not in the public eye. And she probably had somebody there also to kind of protect her and make sure that there was nobody coming and that she wouldn't be hurt from anybody. And she immersed in the mikveh, although it was exceedingly cold. And she says, that was, a really hard thing that I did, but I pushed myself to do it. And I want to tell you that night I conceived a child, and that is the child that the Rebbe was so mesmerized by. And I believe that this child has an extra special spiritual dimension because I went to the mikveh even though it was so difficult. And I believe as well, now I'm talking, this is not part of the story anymore, that part of the reason that the Jewish people have displayed such incredible resilience over the thousands of years of persecution, and part of the reason that we do have a sixth sense and an extra special power for success is because of the mitzvah of the mikvah. That the Zohar says that a child that's conceived in a family of purity, and purity means that the woman has immersed in the mikvah 7 days after her menstrual cycle has ceased. That relationship between the husband and wife that produces that child where the woman conceives, that union has an extra spiritual dimension, and the child receives that extra dimension of spirituality, and it's really a gift for them for their entire life, a child that was born in purity. I want to talk a little bit about an idea from the Kabbalah as well, which is that every mikvah has a little bit of the water from the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden. And Gan Eden is the ultimate healing experience, because the very first trauma that we experienced collectively was from our great-great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-grandmother, Adam and Eve. And at first they lived an idyllic life, and they were naked and not embarrassed. That's how safe they felt. They can just be vulnerable and not be afraid that anyone was going to take advantage of them. And then they made a mistake. They ate from this tree with the forbidden fruit, the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge of good and bad. And God came to them and said, did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? Okay, we're going to make some changes here. First of all, you got to be clothed. Can't be so vulnerable anymore. We have to have a little bit of protective measures, modesty in place. And also, you are no longer going to be able to live in the Garden of Eden. So I hope you enjoyed, but the party's over, and now we're moving to a new life outside of the Garden of Eden. And this is also perhaps the nature of every relationship. That in the beginning of a relationship, we feel a certain safety. Maybe it's a pretend safety, maybe it's just an illusion or a delusion. But there's a certain sense of, I could trust this person, and I really think that everything is going to be okay, and I can tell this person my secrets and still feel safe. And even my vulnerabilities have a certain sweetness in the sense that I can share something so personal with you, and that adds to the tenderness of the relationship. I'm not worried that you're going to take advantage of me because I shared with you a challenge that I had in the past, or I shared with you a character flaw. It only adds to the beauty of the relationship. And a person many times in the beginning of a relationship gives without end and without looking for reciprocity. It's almost as if the giving is the pleasure itself. Being able to make another person happy, seeing them happy is so pleasurable that it's like, I'm not even keeping track. I just have so much credit in your eyes. I want to keep it going. But that doesn't last, because as a relationship progresses, there is a sense of a guard that goes up. And all of a sudden, a person can very easily think, I'm giving a lot, and I don't know if you're giving as much as I am. I feel like you're taking advantage of me. And when I'm hurt especially, I feel like, and look what I did. And I went so far for your birthday, and I made sure that you had a beautiful, what did you do for mine? And I made sure that you had food to eat, and then you come and you spend time on the phone and you're ignoring me. So there's a certain tit for tat, that mentality that comes into a relationship that's the cause of a lot of arguments and a lot of negative thought processes. And it comes from a sense that I'm not willing to be so vulnerable anymore. I have my guard up. I want to make sure that things are even, things are equal. I'm not being taken advantage of. And that's kind of like the post-Garden of Eden mentality, where now I need clothing. I need to make sure that I'm protected and that I am not being taken for a ride in this relationship. And I'm keeping track. And ideally, we want to get back to the Garden of Eden state, but that takes that takes a tremendous amount of work. And yet, there's something that we have, a gift of correction, a gift of repair that Hashem gave us and Hashem prescribed in the Torah, which is the incredible mitzvah of the mikvah, that allows us to every single month to repair. Because a relationship could be so problematic, but if there is the opportunity to repair, to go back and fix, then the problems become a learning experience, and they become a catalyst for growth and for insight into myself and the other person, and maybe even social skills in general. What is that growth? That's the mikvah. So here's something really interesting. When the Torah describes the Garden of Eden, the Torah says that God made man and he put him in the Garden of Eden. And then the Torah goes on to describe the trees in the Garden of Eden. There was the tree of knowledge, good and bad, the one that they were forbidden to eat from. And then there was another tree that was the tree of life. And I'm sure there were many other trees that the Torah doesn't describe. And then the Torah says that there was a river flowing out of the garden. Actually, it was flowing out of Eden. There was a garden in Eden, but there was a river flowing out of Eden. And it then divided into 4 heads, meaning four separate rivers that were coming out of the one main river. And the Torah spills a lot of ink in telling us where each river went. And we're kind of like, okay, why do I need to know that? And then after it talks about the one river that split into 4 and where all the 4 rivers went, it goes back to telling us the story of Adam and Eve, and eventually about their mistake in eating from the tree of knowledge, the fruit from the forbidden tree. And many of the commentaries wonder why the Torah tells us about these 4 rivers. Also, Rashi is able to identify 3 of the 4 rivers, the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, and the Nile River. So we know where this is. Now we know the Tigris or Tigris, whichever way you pronounce it, and Euphrates River, they actually do connect in Kuwait. And that area between the Tigris and Euphrates River is called the Fertile Crescent, the big cradle of civilization. Even secular historians agree that this is where life began. And this is directly concurs with what the Torah tells us, that this is the Garden of Eden. It was somehow at the beginning of these 2 rivers when they joined together. Again, like I said, that's in the Kuwait area, and that whole area of the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, that whole area in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where Adam and Eve lived, and all of their descendants, Noah and Abraham, until Abraham left to go to Israel, which is also pretty much in that area. Today, the Nile River doesn't connect to the Tigris and Euphrates River, but it's not too far away. So that whole area was the area of the 4 rivers. Now, why is it important for the Torah to tell us this and to identify those rivers in order to tell us this is a real thing? The Garden of Eden is not just a fantasy. I want to give you the GPS location. I want to show you that there are still remnants of the Garden of Eden and the topography of the Garden of Eden today. You can pinpoint it. A part of that is so that we can feel connected to it, and we can even access the spirit of the Garden of Eden. So Kabbalah tells us that these rivers stream into all natural bodies of water, through rivers, lakes, and oceans. And when we immerse in a natural body of water, we are able to ingest, not in our mouths, but let the waters of the Garden of Eden soak into our skin, into our soul, and into our psyche. And of course, this happens when a woman follows the schedule and the discipline of the cycle of family purity, which culminates in her immersion of the mikvah. And during that time, she's able to unleash and uncover the powerful forces in the natural body of water and let them all seep into her so she could take full advantage of that. And by doing this, she creates a new spark of life and hope into her relationship. It's a monthly ritual of healing because she's accessing the Garden of Eden energy, the energy in a relationship where it's much more about giving than about receiving. It's much more about trust than it is about disillusion. And that's what we want to get back to in any relationship. That's what feeds goodness and kindness and consideration in a relationship, is when we could let go of being afraid that the other person is going to take advantage of us. Of course, there are times when you have to be very much aware and on guard of somebody taking advantage of you. But at the same time, and in a relationship where it's not an abusive relationship, but a relationship of 2 people that are just trying to get their acts together but keep tripping over their own egos and their own dysfunctional social skills and behaviors that they learned that are just not working for a relationship, that immersion brings them back, spiritually speaking, to a place that preceded all of the mistrust. And it even preceded the mistrust of the human condition because it's connected and linked to the environment in the Garden of Eden. Now, this is all happening on a spiritual level. And it's not that a person who goes to the mikvah and walks out always is in tune with what's happening spiritually. Many times, if not most of the times, the motivation for going to the mikvah is not that I'm looking to heal from my trauma, but because this is the Jewish thing to do. This is a mitzvah that's been treasured for thousands of years in Jewish society. This is how Jews marry. This is how Jews relate. This is the cycle of family purity that God gave us as his gift. And yet, even though that's the primary motivation, there is so much happening in that immersion in the mikvah that we are not even aware of most of the times, although sometimes we may be open and privy to feeling that shift, that metamorphosis, that cleansing, that healing that comes through immersion in the mikvah. Just one last thought before we do conclude for today. And by the way, again, anybody who wants to send any questions up about the mikvah, practical, controversial, you agree, you disagree with me, I'm totally would love a dialogue. But one thought. A lot of what drains us of enthusiasm in life and in relationships is the natural inclination to take things for granted. Just part of the human condition, maybe part of our negativity bias. But most people will lose touch with the pleasure, joy, excitement, thrill of any pleasure in life once they've had it for long enough. That could apply to a new car. I had used cars for so long, for so many years, and then 2.5 years ago, my husband leased me a new minivan, and it was like amazing. It was all, it was all, drove so beautifully, and the seats were clean, and, the first few days that I drove around in it, I felt like a queen. Couldn't believe that I have a spanking new car. And now, if I tell you, I don't even feel that way at all. I'm grateful that I have a car, a minivan that works, but I never have that sense of thrill or excitement when I get into my car. It's just a car. Just try to keep it clean. And tell the kids to clean up their popcorn that they may have spilled on the floor. And make sure I get my oil changed. And the same thing with a house. I can imagine people, and I can just speak for myself. I have a tremendous dream to update my home and redo it and to live in a beautiful home. And God willing, if Hashem wants, that dream may come true, and I may be able to take out a second mortgage and update my house. And I think, in my mind, I'm imagining every day I'm going to wake up and just be thrilled to be living in an updated house. But I know it's not true. I won't, because I know people that live in nice, beautiful, updated homes. They lose touch of that thrill after a while. And the same thing with relationships. A lot of times before we're in a relationship, we can daydream and fantasize from today until tomorrow how wonderful it will be to be in a relationship, to have somebody, a companion to share life with, to go through all the holidays and the regular days with somebody, to have the love and affection and adoration of a relationship. And hopefully that dream comes true. And for many people, they end up finding somebody that they can live a wonderful life with. And for those who haven't yet, I give you a blessing from my heart that Hashem should put you together in an easy and smooth way with your soulmate that you can live a beautiful life with. But eventually, and after a little while, that sense of gratitude and appreciation for having had all of our fantasies come true wears off, maybe because we see that there are so many flaws in our spouse, or maybe we just kind of get used to it, and it's like, okay, big deal, so I'm in a relationship, so I get to have the pleasures of having a physical relationship, big deal. And then of course we start to compare ourselves to other people and say, yeah, well, they also have a relationship, and they have some perks in their relationship that I don't have in mine, or at least that's what I imagine to be true. At least the part of their life that is visible to me seems to be better than mine. And again, that all comes from the sense of from a lack of gratitude that is so natural because any good thing, the sensation of thrill and pleasure wears off. And the laws of family purity and the mikvah come to reinvigorate a relationship in a really spectacular way. In the sense that from the time that a woman begins her menstrual cycle until she immerses in the mikvah, which is 7 days after her menstrual cycle ends, the man and the woman refrain from physical relationships. And that could be really hard, and it should be hard. And after a few days, and after the minimum of 12 days before a woman can immerse, sometimes it's longer than those 12 days, in many relationships, they stop taking each other for granted because they have been craving the physical relationship for those 12 days, 2 weeks, or sometimes more. And it becomes so refreshing to realize that I can experience the pleasure of being in a relationship with my spouse. And it is not something to take for granted, because I have a little honeymoon for those 2 weeks until my menstrual cycle starts again. And that is a gift. I don't always have it. And that dynamic itself can create correction and healing in a relationship. Of course, this is in a healthy relationship, in a non-abusive relationship, and there are also many other factors that are needed to maintain a happy, healthy relationship that we've spoken about in the past. But this is an incredibly powerful spiritual tool to invigorate a relationship and to bring God into the relationship, which gives me, my spouse, and my children an additional power that I can't see and I can't touch, but that's been a gift for the Jewish people since the giving of the Torah. This is the mikvah. This is the gift of family purity.
Click subscribe to see more exclusive content from the most sought-after Jewish speakers, teachers, and thinkers.